I'm doing the intro. I'm doing the intro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th episode of the Theos Bound podcast. I am joined by as always, by my infallible, irreplaceable, incandescent co-host, Nate. And today we're going to be talking about the fall, or the fall of man, the fall of Adam and Eve, the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You could keep going with that. You can make it longer and longer. But all we want to talk about today is what the fall was historically, symbolically, philosophically, theologically, and what the consequences of the fall were. And for that, when it comes to discussing symbolism and all of that, if you actually read what the church fathers say about it, it's pretty consistent. It's pretty consistently understood that in order to talk about the symbolic or the philosophical and theological meanings, what some people would call the deeper meanings to these biblical texts, you first need to ground it in actual history, because if it's not historically based, then there actually is no grounding for the symbolism itself. This is something that St. Augustine talks about, who is often cited by non-creationists as being someone who didn't take Genesis literally, which is I think it's true in certain respects, but he also was a young earther. So, I mean, like every church father, aside from, Origen isn't even a church father. So every church father essentially was a young earther. So I'm going to pass it off to Nate to give a brief summary and synopsis of the fall narrative as presented in the book of Genesis. And perhaps he'll touch on why that's a big topic, why it is historical, but you can talk about why it's important maybe to see it and interpret it is historically. And when we mean historically, we don't mean to the detriment of the symbolic meaning. And when we talk about the symbolic meaning, we don't mean to the detriment of the historical meaning.
Yeah, I don't think we'll get too much into the actual historicity of the fall and Genesis as a whole, because that's a big can of worms to open up for a short little podcast that we're doing.
Mhm.
Maybe one day we can do a podcast, maybe with a particular gentleman that we know on the historicity of
And Ham.
the Old Testament. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. I'm not too far away from his little arc exhibit right now.
Really? Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But anyways, the fall is presented in the Bible as, to put it as simply as possible, it's the opposite of the journey up towards God. The fall isn't, well, for starters, it's hard to get into the discussion of the fall because it is the opposite of the journey up towards God, and because there's an infinite amount of ways to take up that journey up towards God. So also there's an infinite amount of ways to fall away from God. And I know G.K. Chesterton talks about this in his book, Orthodoxy. Christianity is so hard to talk about because it's about everything. So it's like, what starting point do we choose? It involves everything. So also the fall, because it's the exact opposite of that, we can start from anywhere and talk about it because it's the inverse of the infinite journey up towards God, right? Now, when I talk about it that way, it makes it sound like the fall and evil are kind of like equal forces to ascension up towards God and good, but that's wrong. The fall is purely negative. Evil is purely negative. It has no positive existence, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing that a lot this episode. But for those of you that do not really know what we're talking about when we say the fall, in Christianity, we have in Genesis 1 and 2, we have the creation of the world in 6 days. And then this is what James Jordan argues, as well as Seraphim Hamilton and plenty of other people as well. On the 7th day, we have the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the day that God rested. He rested from his creative works, and he allowed man to or he gave man a sort of like a test to see if man will reciprocate the gift of creation back to God. Because as we know from pretty much every podcast that we've done in the past, reality exists in communion. And in order for man to establish himself in reality as a servant of God, a righteous servant of God, he had to prove himself on the Sabbath that he was willing to not take God's gift to himself for himself, but rather he would take God's gift thankfully and willingly work alongside God to develop creation. And so on the Sabbath, what we see is that God tested man by putting forth one pretty simple commandment. Like it really isn't too difficult of a commandment. It's just don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so what did man do? He ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, of course, he was tempted by the serpent, and we'll talk more about that later. But basically, man was given a commandment by God to recognize that creation ultimately belongs to God, and that man's knowledge of creation and his ableness to work in creation, or his ability to work in creation, is dependent on God's giving man that ability. Man can't take that ability for himself, because the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil, it's all about kingship. It's all about knowing what is good and what is not good for particular tasks. Kings have to know what land is good for farming, what land is good for residence, and so on and so forth, and what land is evil or less good, because we know that evil is simply just something that's not as good as something else. So the knowledge of good and evil is the knowledge of what particular things are good for and what they're not good for. It's knowing to what telos things move and understanding how to work in those things to move them towards their telos. So the fall of man is man trying to take that knowledge for himself, trying to take creation and the utility of creation to serve his own means, rather than recognizing on the Sabbath that God is the one who gives us the ability to work in creation and the one who gives us creation in all of its utility. We can't take that for ourselves. So the fall of man is just man's trying to take creation for himself instead of recognizing that it's a gift from God.
Right. And something that you mentioned is that the telos of man and the telos of every created being involves a proper well, for one, it's a hierarchical ascent upwards, as the high point comes down and then takes up the lower parts up alongside it. I mean, the archetypal story is Christ's death and then resurrection and ascension. Well, incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension. This is the highest point, God himself coming down to the lowest, suffering death itself, and then arising and bringing those who are united to him up into heaven. Now, we see when we are talking about the telos of not only man, but also creatures, we need to understand the cosmic scope of man, both man's dominion and by consequence the fall. This is something that St. Maximus the Confessor talks about and emphasizes greatly. And I would say most of the church fathers are pretty clear about this, especially the Eastern ones. It's that man is the center of creation, as the microcosm of the universe, as the unification of heaven and earth. Man is both body and soul, matter and spirit. And the logi, the telos, or the teloses, I don't know what the plural of that is, of the of created beings are imminently connected to man. So nothing, because as Nate was talking about, the goal, I think Nate mentioned, or he's talked about before, the purpose of creation and of man was for man to cultivate creation technologically, and while in a proper union with God, and through this union with God, knowing and truly knowing the logi, the knowledge of good and evil, of what is how to cultivate things properly in the world. And the purpose was to cultivate the world, learn about it, grow it, develop it, and give it to the back to God in Thanksgiving. Now, what happens with the fall? The reason why the fall is a cosmic event is because the teloses of created beings are connected to man. Essentially, there's no disconnecting any created being from us as the unity of heaven and earth. Because of that, when man sins, these created beings, they no longer, they, just as we are no longer in a proper hierarchical ascent towards God, these created beings can no longer be in a proper hierarchical ascent towards us. We have lost the knowledge of we have lost the true understanding and ability to cultivate the world properly. And the world, by extension, has lost that hierarchical point to which it can ascend to. So I'm getting more into speculative territory here, but it's almost like I think it's true that we not only abandon God, who of course never abandoned us, but we abandon creation. So it would be analogous to God abandoning us. There's no hope for us, and we abandoned creation, and we became lost in the fall. And because of that, there was a cosmic. And you have to understand the way Orthodox metaphysics works in terms of teleology and all of this stuff. As St. Maximus the Confessor talks about, there's a natural motion to all created beings. Now, what happens with the fall is this natural motion is destroyed by sin. Now, this sin enters into the world through man, but because man is that point to which creation is moving towards, and because man is that connection between heaven and earth, and creation is made to ascend into heaven and to unite itself with heaven. When man sins, when that top point of creation falls, it falls into, and this is why the fathers talk about a fall from the spirit to the body. It's not understanding and failing to have the proper hierarchy of body, soul, and spirit, in which the spirit is the top point, the point of freedom, the point of control, and you lose yourself to the passions. This is a break in the cosmic teleological order. No longer can there be this ascent towards the high point, because the high point is no longer there. Man has fallen to the level of the lowly creatures. So this is why, to briefly touch on a separate point, but connected as well, when we talk about communion, you'll often, this is what I've encountered, people will talk about, oh, there's relational ontologies in modern philosophy. Like, we could say that, I would say that traditional Aristotelian philosophy, Platonic philosophy, is too it's too hierarchical, and this is something Peugeot talks about. It doesn't understand how the high point can become the low one. It doesn't understand how God could be a slave. I don't think Aristotle could ever conceptualize that. So it doesn't have a proper understanding of this, of the relations, of the ability for there to be mutual interiority between the high point and the low point, without negating the highness of, without negating the hierarchy itself. Now, modernity, I think, understands this, but it doesn't understand that this always has to occur in a proper hierarchy, or you lose, or you just get a collapse of everything into itself, into this flat horizontal plane, which is in postmodernity, the philosophical concept used to describe that is the rhizome. Deleuze and Guattari specifically talk about how there is the aberrant, I think, ontology, where it's like a tree which goes upwards. That is the Christian ontology, and they instead put forth the concept of the rhizome, and the rhizome is this flat horizontal plane. Like, a rhizome is like a root where there's it's not a hierarchy, but it's just different points all connected in these relations. That isn't the communal ontology. Communal ontology, communion, is properly ordered. It's a properly ordered hierarchy where the hierarchy isn't negated, but nor is there just this dominance hierarchy, which we see in antiquity. So we see how modernity and antiquity represent two different poles, two different forms of conceptualizing reality, one hierarchical, one purely immanent relational. which both lead to division and atomization, and simply because this all leads back to the point of teleology. They're not understanding the proper telos of creation, which is ascent upwards into heaven through man as we cultivate creation, and through uniting it to the work of Jesus Christ, we give it back to the Father. So that was a long rant just to say that in order to understand the fall, you need to understand teleology. And in order to truly understand Orthodox teleology, you need to understand how man is the summit, the peak, the purpose, the telos of creation is man himself. And that is why Jesus Christ didn't become incarnate as a stone. He became incarnate as a man. And in order to fulfill our proper vocation for us, in order to do what we were supposed to do. And in doing that, he now in himself, in the hypostatic union of God and man, he is now united the world and ordered the world properly back into himself. And this is what it means to be in the millennium. We are in the millennium now, where we are. The consequences of the fall haven't been completely broken, but the fall itself has been redeemed. The fall is no longer the active. There is no longer an active spiral downwards anymore ever since the ascent of Jesus Christ. But now we're moving upwards back. Sorry, not the ascent, the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Now there is an active ascension upwards alongside him. So I'm just going to pass it back off to Nate to see if he has any comments on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. How you're saying that sin is no longer the active agent in mankind anymore, and something that I never really thought about until a couple of days ago. I was reading something and someone mentioned how the devil really isn't in the Old Testament very much. Like, he is not mentioned as a character in the entire Pentateuch. After Genesis 3, we do not see the devil as a character really at all. And that's because what happens in Genesis 3 is there's this sort of mutual attempt at establishing a power dynamic over the other. Satan is coming in Genesis 3, and he's trying to establish power over man. He views the world as this dominance hierarchy where he needs to assert himself as above man and control man to allow himself to exert his influence in creation, because he knows that man is at the heart of creation. So he knows if he can control man, he can bring all of creation towards himself, to serve himself rather than towards its actual telos. Now, what the devil didn't realize, well, maybe he did realize this, but he still chose to do it, that this is a purely self-destructive act, but we don't need to get into all of that right now. And what we also see happen in the fall, or in Genesis 3, is man is attempting to establish a power dynamic himself. He sees that he sees the temptation that the devil is putting forth before him, that he can become like a god, that he doesn't really need God. Maybe God's lying to you. Maybe God is just trying to trick you so that he can maintain his power and his authority over you. So what you need to do is you need to go grab that power and the authority for yourself so that you can have the power in that relationship. So what we see in Genesis 3 is this purely cynical view of relationships, this view where it's just a battle for power. And we see the same thing between Adam and Eve themselves. Adam allows Eve, even though that he knows that her eating that apple, or whatever it was, probably not an apple, probably like a fig, her eating that fruit will be detrimental to her, he lets her do it anyway. And then he does it after he sees, okay, there were no consequences, so maybe it's not that bad. So there's even a power struggle between Adam and Eve themselves. And what we see is this constant power struggle. But where was I going with this? Oh, yeah, the devil himself. After Genesis 3, we don't really see this character pop up again. And that's because he appears through man throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Because Satan knows in Genesis 3 that the only way that he can really manipulate creation is by establishing this power dynamic over man and working evil in creation through man. And so that's what he does. He establishes himself he establishes himself in Genesis 3, tempts man, tricks man into falling into sin, and now he was given authority by man to operate in creation. And in the curses of Genesis 3, we see two sort of uh, we see two lineages that follow after the curse. We see the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman, obviously, being the righteous line through whom we get Jesus Christ, who crushes the head of the serpent. And then we see the seed of the serpent, which is how the devil operates throughout the Old Testament. The seed of the serpent is fallen mankind, basically. And that is how the devil pops up throughout the rest of the Old Testament. And we see this constantly in Genesis. We see this fight between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And the seed of the serpent is almost always an anti-God king, like Pharaoh, Abimelech, and all these characters that are these tyrannical authorities that are trying to oppress the seed of the woman. And to further this point, in Genesis 4, in the sort of the second fall of Genesis, the fall of Cain, we see this line that sin is crouching at his door. Now, this is a reference to the serpent whose belly is on the ground. He's kind of always crouching. And the door is reference to a birthway or a birth passage. In Genesis and throughout the rest of the Bible, we see all these birth announcements always happen near a doorway. And that's because the household sort of represents the woman, and the doorway is obviously the birth passage into the outside world. So if sin is crouching at the door, that means that the seed of the woman is being attacked by the serpent. And that's why throughout the Old Testament, the serpent appears through these tyrannical men. It's through men that evil operates. Satan can't just go and take creation for himself. He has to operate through man. Mm-hmm. He can't do it himself.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how we see that the power of Satan is simply the power of temptation, and it always has been. Now, there are cases of stuff like demonic possession, and I think that's a more complex topic, but I mean, a lot of the time, you have to be, I think human beings have to be actively willing to be, to experience this sort of a complete loss of your own will to another being. But yeah, that's a different topic. But yeah, the power, quote unquote, of Satan, or all Satan can do is tempt, and that is why, at least in Orthodox Christianity, but basically in all forms of Christianity, there's a strong emphasis on resisting temptation. Now, I kind of want to move to something more philosophical, or more, I don't know, theological, even, to talk about the meaning of what Nate was talking about earlier in terms of the sin of Adam and Eve as this attempt to live in a self-autonomous mode. Now, the thing is, to live self-autonomously is not possible. Self-autonomy, you can replace self-autonomy with nothing. It's the exact same word, because to live, or exact same meaning. To live purely self-autonomously, to live outside of communion, is impossible, because you receive your being from God at every single moment. At every single moment, you are experiencing the energies of God who is sustaining your being. And even God himself exists thanks to an event of communion. This is what John Zazula says. You cannot have the Father without the Son. You cannot have the Son without the Father. If in some impossible universe, purely speculatively, you were to lose one of the persons of the Trinity, there would be no God, because to be God means to be in this eternal Trinitarian communion. So in the same way, to be man means to be in a Trinitarian communion. Sorry, not in the Trinity, but in a communion. Now, the fall was an attempt, and that's the important word, an attempt to exist self-autonomously. The fall didn't introduce a self-autonomous mode of existence. This is what you'll hear people like Hegel or Zizek say. In fact, they basically identify the fall with the origin of freedom, the fall with the origin of consciousness. That is wrong. We do not see the fall as the origin of consciousness, but it is the origin of a certain mode of consciousness. This sort of consciousness is the consciousness of the ego. a self-enclosed type of consciousness, and I think you even see this sort of creeping in before the fall itself. And you see that with Adam, as Nate was talking about, with Adam not warning his wife about the consequences of eating of the fruit while she is being tempted by Satan. Because what is the purpose of our existence? It's mutual interiority. Now, mutual interiority is, I mean, it involves a mutual interiority of minds. Like, simply put, those in heaven can read each other's minds. Now, in our world, this seems like the most horrifying prospect. It's truly a traumatizing idea if you really think through it, of anyone at any point being able to read your mind. But it's not really traumatizing if you have nothing to hide. But Adam and Eve, in that moment where almost the fall before the fall, we can call it the temptation that occurs before the sin, the actual sin. He closes himself off from Eve. He hides something from Eve and withdraws into himself. Now, this is the essence, I think, of this sort of consciousness. This sort of consciousness that's defined by, as Christos Yannaris talks about in relation to Sartre, and what Jean-Paul Sartre talks about with shame and consciousness. There is a sort of shame in our relationships with the other. And this all goes back to the fall, because with Adam's refusal to open himself up to Eve, to warn Eve, and instead close himself off into himself, in which occurs, this self-enclosure occurs more and more and more throughout history, and most importantly, or not most importantly, but for our context, even in the fall narrative itself, when Adam and Eve, of course, are naked and then they cover themselves in garments of fig leaves or whatever leaves. I think it's fig leaves. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the this self-enclosure is the essence of the type of consciousness we're talking about. But true consciousness is not self-enclosed. If you want to take this to its logical conclusion, this is something I have talked about so much, is if you want to take this self-enclosed consciousness to its logical conclusion, you get hell itself. This is what Pavel Florensky says. This is what Dimitri Staniloy says. This is what Slavoj Žižek says, but Žižek doesn't use the term hell because he's not a Christian. But the terms that he uses to describe this consciousness, the void, the abyss, the night of the world, these are all hellish. They have hellish connotations, because the abyss of self-enclosure is hell. It is a pure separation from communion, a separation from all communion into your own abyss. It's a nightmarish, hellish, paradoxically eternal existence. We don't want to get into the theology of time. You can watch our episode on that. I think it was the third episode we did, if you want to get into that.
But we ended up getting into it in pretty much every episode we've done. So
yeah, we have. But it's okay. Very quickly, time is the form of communion. Time is the interval of waiting between acts of relation. If there is no relation, there can be no time. Simply put, read Staniloy's essay, Eternity and Time. So that's why hell is eternal. It is the opposite of the eternity of heaven, which is the full fulfillment of time, perfect mutual interiority, perfect relation. Now, with the fall, you have a break from what had been the proper communion of between God and man. There was it wasn't filled yet. It wasn't eternity. It wasn't the eschaton, but it was nonetheless a properly ordered world that was in an upward ascent towards God. With the fall, there is a spiral inwards, where it's not into, as Nate was saying, it's not earlier, it's not like good is on one side, evil is on one side. They're two different substances battling it out. We don't hold to any sort of dualism in that sense. But what happened in the fall is that there was a retreat inwards. That's why Adam and Eve are ashamed. They can't be in this open dialogical relationship anymore. They have to clothe themselves. They need to hide in shame. I think shame is an essential part of the fall and of sin. But what shame means is that you still have a sort of ethical if you truly feel ashamed, that means you understand there is that moral intuition that what you have done is wrong in a certain sense, and that even that it could be different. So that points to the reality that the fall wasn't a complete severance of communion. It wasn't a complete break, because as I said at the beginning of this, what I just started saying, a complete break of communion would be nothing at all. Complete self-autonomy would be nothing at all. So what Adam and Eve did was they attempted to live according to a self-relating mode of being. They failed, and they still lived in a sort of broken form of communion. And what this entails is that the fall was literally a fall into a less than real reality. It was a fall into the subjective. It was a fall into the subject itself. The fall of, and that is the sort of consciousness that arises. This divided subjectivity, a subjectivity divided from the other, as I've been talking about, but also divided from itself, as I've talked about elsewhere. And this sort of consciousness is what arises in the fall. And that is why, as Sarah from Hamilton has talked about, we almost live in a sort of dream world. This is something C.S. Lewis talks about. And when Christ finally returns, when eternity is united with time, it will be like we woke out of this dream. We have woken out of the dream, and we have entered into objectivity, because in the fall, we fall into subjectivity. We fall into ourselves. There's nowhere else to fall but ourselves. You don't fall into some space known as hell, because as C.S. Lewis talks about in The Great Divorce, there is no space. The hell doesn't have any space. All it is your own ego. It's to fall into the ego. And that is why the ultimate goal of Christianity is humility. That's why St. Paisios says God doesn't want anything from you except for humility, because humility is this opening, this leaving of your own self-enclosed abyss, separating yourself from your sin, repentance, and then this allows for the opening up of yourself towards the other, towards God, and that is how you enter into communion. And that communion was what was broken in the fall. Not a complete break, but it was nonetheless a sort of separation, which actually leads to an infinite separation, which I mean Nate can talk about if he would like to, but I'm sure he has other stuff to say as well.
Yeah, that it's a good point that the fall away from God's reality is a fall into fiction, I guess you could say, a fall into the subjective, a fall away from reality into your own sort of strange ideas, right? And we see that very concretely in the Bible. In Genesis 3, what happens directly after the fall is Adam and Eve, they do this very illogical, it's very illogical what they do. Like, if God is truly God, then obviously they can't just hide from him by hiding in a couple bushes in the garden, right? But that's exactly what they do. They sort of trap themselves in this illogical, anxiety-driven fantasy world, right? And from Adam, for the next few like generations, we see a deeper and deeper fall into this sort of anxiety-driven fictional world that man is creating for himself. I mean, Cain goes and he builds himself a city out of fear. It's out of anxiety. He doesn't truly believe that God will protect him with the mark that he gave him. He goes and he has to build himself a city because he's built these fictional ideas about he's built these fictional ideas about the faithfulness of God in his mind and how God holds up to his word. So he has to go and he has to create himself his own world to hide in. And then with Lamech, we see this amplified even more. He completely he creates his own fictional mark for himself. He says himself that unlike God, who promised Cain that whoever kills Cain, that Cain will be avenged sevenfold, Lamech himself declares Lamech will be avenged 77-fold. Like he's speaking his own fictional reality into existence. It's just a complete descent into illogical, fantastical madness. Like there is this complete break from reality and man's mind that happens in the gradual fall of man throughout Genesis that eventually leads to the flood. And accompanying this gradual withdrawal into man's own mind, into his own fiction, we see this ever increasing anxiety, right? It's out of anxiety that Cain goes and builds his own city. And then Lamech, it's out of anxiety that he declares this thing over himself. And that's because anxiety is precisely the state of being separated from reality. And you see your situation that you're in, and you know that this is not what it should be. That's precisely what anxiety is. And what makes anxiety worse, as we see in Genesis, is refusing to fix that solution, refusing to look to what will fix your situation, and instead just staying in that situation and building your walls higher for yourself and continuing to withdraw within yourself to hide from the problems. Whereas what God tells us to do is to face our problems and knowing that he will save us in the end, right? Now, on the topic of this sort of the multiple falls that we see in Genesis, this is something that I've learned from James Jordan. What we see is sort of three distinct falls of man in the first few chapters of Genesis. We see the fall of Adam, and then we see the fall of Cain, and then we see the Nephilim, which constitutes the third fall. And this is a pattern that sort of is all over scripture. I mean, let's look at the history of Israel, for example. Okay, in the time of the judges, Israel worshipped other gods and they lost their tabernacle. This is parallel to Adam worshiping the devil in the garden and losing the garden sanctuary of Eden, which would be parallel to Israel losing the tabernacle after worshiping other gods in the time of the judges. In the time of the kings, we see the two kingdoms fighting against each other. We see Israel and Judah not getting along very well. And this is just like the two brothers in Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. And Israel is then exiled from the land, just like Cain was exiled from the land of Eden in his fall. And then the time after the exile, we see the problem of intermarriage in Ezra and Nehemiah, just like the intermarriage between the sons of God and the daughters of man in Genesis 6. This sort of threefold fall is a pattern that's all over scripture. Now, this is something that I was just reading from James Jordan yesterday, so I haven't really had the time to sort of put this together, but I think that this is obviously like an anti-Trinitarian fall. Since reality is Trinitarian, the fall away from reality will be anti-Trinitarian. And I mean, you have a video that talks about this on the anti-Trinitarian death of God. And I think that's just another example of this threefold fall away from God. But I haven't really exactly parsed out how that anti-Trinitarian fall applies to the three falls that we see as a pattern throughout scripture. If you have anything to add to that, you can. If not, I have some other stuff to say.
Yeah, you can continue.
Okay. In these falls, in every single one of these falls, we see a fall not just vertically away from God, but we also see a fall horizontally. We see in the fall of Adam of man, we see Adam falling away from God and Adam and Eve falling away from each other. There's the vertical and the horizontal. We see the same thing with the fall of Cain. He falls away from God and he falls away from his brother. Same thing with the story of the Nephilim. We see really prevalent in the story of the Nephilim, this failure to unite the vertical and the horizontal, but we might get to that a little bit more later. We can understand this as the movement away from the communal cross. Like if we understand reality, the fundamental image of reality is a cross. There's the vertical and the horizontal, and they both stretch out in this three-dimensional structure towards infinity, right? So what you'd expect in the fall, which is a withdrawal, is not just the vertical closing, but the horizontal closing as well. Both are withdrawing towards this one-dimensional point in the center, which is the one-dimensional point of negativity, of the abyss, right? All these Zizekian terms. That's hell. That one-dimensional point is hell. And to try to draw a little bit more of a concrete image as to how this fall happens, if we understand the cross is reaching out towards infinity, anything short of infinity is infinitely short of infinity, right? So any limitation that you put on that infinite reaching out of the cross draws a limited circle upon it, and anything that's limited is infinitely short of infinity. So that's a little image that you can use to try to help yourself wrap your head around this. And you can think that as you withdraw further and further away from infinity, this circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it's eventually that ever withdrawing negative point of one dimensionality in the center.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, the center is, there's different ways to understand the center, and in terms of what ontology you're using. Now, the center, if we're saying that the center is the abyss of the self, of the ego, the point is not to destroy the center. It's not a destruction of the ego. It's not a Buddhist idea of nirvana, where you lose the ego, you become one with the universe or whatever. But it's, as the symbolism of the cross seems to point to, it's an opening up from the center, flows every other point horizontally. So symbolically, that would mean we are meant to commune with creation, with others, and we are meant to commune with God. And upwards and downwards, I would assume the downwards would be symbolic of creation, or I don't, yeah. So like this is a creation of this is a, and then we see what I was talking about as man as the center. Man is the center who unites heaven and earth. So that middle point of the cross, that is man. And most significantly, the first true man who truly fulfilled his calling as the center was Jesus Christ, the God-man. Now, this is the problem with the fall was, you can understand when I was talking about in terms of what is very common in Orthodox Christian writing as a fall into the passions, as a fall away from the spiritual world into the bodily. It's a decentering of reality. Reality is and without the proper center, there's a complete disharmony. Like what I was talking about in terms of the cosmic scope of the fall. If we want to continue using the symbolism of the cross, imagine just having the center completely falling away into the lower parts. Like it's no longer a proper order anymore. It's just false. And that's what you see in the fall. The fall is, and this is really the crucial point about understanding the fall. One, it's not a fall into some objectively existing fallen world, like a fallen substance. There is no substance of the fall itself. The fall is nothing more than this very attempt to self-relate, this very attempt to be self-autonomous. So what is the fall? It is that very movement of the will into itself. It's a very attempt. So the fall isn't what the will moves towards, right? The fall is the will itself in that movement. It is that's why I think it's Saint Macarius the Great says, but every East and West, this is a united idea of what evil is. Every patristic writer says that evil is not an objectively existing substance. It is nothing more than the deprivation of good. And what I believe it Saint Macarius says explicitly, that evil is not a thing, it is the improper use of a thing. And
that's also Saint Athanasius says the same thing.
Yeah. So it's the improper use, the failing to, if you have to, in order to understand this, so you have to be working within the teleological metaphysics of orthodoxy, where there is an objectively good way to use things and an objectively bad way to use things. Now, that is basically all I have to say on the topic of the fall. I think I'm just going to summarize what I think are the most important points of this discussion that we've touched on so far. It's that the fall was a break in communion between God and man, but not an absolute break, or else we would have dissolved into nothingness. The only reason why is because God, in his mercy, kept us in existence. Two, the fall is not a fall into an objective substance. the fall is nothing more than the fall itself, like the very attempt to fall, or the very attempt to self-relate. There is no truly self-relating mode of existence. There is no self-relating substance. There is no such thing as evil, but there are evil acts, and the fall was an evil act, and every sin is an evil act. It is a further decentering of what we were talking about with the symbolism of the cross. It is a decentering, it is a breaking of the harmonious communal relations that constitute true being. And I think 3 is that the fall is, this is very much related to what I was talking, the second point, the fall is a fall into subjectivity. And by subjectivity, we don't mean the sense of selfhood. We mean a break, a break in, um, a break from objectivity, which is constituted by being one with God, being interior to God, because God is that perspective who, as outside of creation, he is able to look down upon it, like what he does on the seventh day of creation. He makes everything. Then the seventh day he rests and looks upon his creation, and that gaze of God is that perspective, is the true perspective of the world. Our perspective is the false perspective insofar as it is not united with God. Because if you even think about it, we have all these different perspectives around us, your perspective, my perspective, other people's perspective, Hitler's perspective. Who's right there? Obviously not Hitler. So the this is what Nietzsche talks about in terms of perspectives. It's a defracturing of the world. Now, not a defracturing, a fracturing of the world. Christ defractures the world. He unites the world into himself. So, and that's what he means by having one mind. He asks the church to have, and he says what he wants for humanity to have one mind. And what mind is that? It's the mind of Christ. We are meant to have that same, we are meant to join into that objective perspective of God, not to destroy our selfhoods, but to have that perfect mutual interiority. So then we can see the world as it objectively is. We can know the true, the logi of things. But when we try to know the logi of things by eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, when we try to do that outside of God, it's impossible. It's not possible to know the true, the way to properly order the world when you yourself are not ordered properly in terms of your relationship with he who knows how to order yourself and how to order the world. So that's a long digression to say essentially that God is objective. He knows objectively what is true, and the fall is a break from the true and into the subjective, the partially true. And it's only partially true insofar as we retain that connection to God. And to be redeemed from the fall, what that means is to know the truth. That's what Christ says. We will know the truth. That's what Paul says. You will see, now you see through a glass darkly, but soon you will be known as you will know as you are known. As God knows you, you will know both yourself and the world. And that is why the fall was a break from the true, from objectivity, from true being, and into the realm of subjectivity, and in the untrue, the irrational, the unreal, and essentially a sort of dream world, which we will one day wake up from if you are united to he who knows the truth, who is Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Now, before I close, before I give my closing statement, there is a can of worms that we could open, which is the fall not of man, but of the angels. Now, if we want to add another 30 minutes onto this podcast, we can get into that. But I think that's best saved for another time. But they are connected because obviously the fall of Satan was pretty much simultaneous to the fall of man in Genesis 3. And without getting into that, I'll let everybody at home think about that until we do our next podcast on the fall of angels. Anyways, to give my closing statements, a bit more on the practical theological side of things, something that we can learn about the fall that helps us today in navigating this this terrible world, uh, this Western world that we live in, that's very that is obviously in a state of fallenness itself right now. Uh,
Yay.
yeah, true. What we see in Genesis 3, the fall of man happened through an attack on man's identity by the serpent. It was an attack on identity. Before the fall, Eve was just named woman. She was not yet named Eve. She had not yet established her identity alongside man in creation, in relationship with man, in relationship with God. She was just simply woman. And that's why she was the perfect person for Satan to attack. She did not yet have her identity established. And so Satan saw this sort of potential, this feminine potential that he could inhabit. And so he went to her. He didn't go to Adam because Adam already had his identity established with God. Adam was specifically given commandments by God. He was specifically given the cultural mandate by God. Eve, who was not Eve yet, she was just woman, had not had that identity established yet. And so Satan saw this blank slate, and he went to her, and he tempted her initially. And now that it isn't in the Bible, we see both the idea that the woman fell first and then the man, but then we also see the idea that it's ultimately the fall of Adam. It is ultimately Adam's fault because he was supposed to be the masculine source of identity. He was right there with Eve in Genesis 3. He could have told her, listen, no, this is not who you are supposed to look up to as your source of identity. We're supposed to be united and look up to God as our source of identity. This is a fraud. He's trying to destroy us. He's subverting us. But that's not what he said. He allowed her to eat the fruit, and he watched his own woman fall. And then it's through the fall of the woman that the door was then opened for the masculine source of identity in the human family to then also fall. And through that, all of creation fell. And that's exactly what we see happening today. There's an attack on man through the feminine persons of the human family, right? There's an attack both on children who have a lack of identity in the form of grooming and butchers going and trying to cut them up into their own perverted, weird fantasy creatures. And we see an attack on women in feminism, and it's through these attacks on the people who are the feminine persons in the human family that we then see an attack on the masculine identity in the human family through this. So there's nothing new under the sun, right? Evil is not creative. Evil is never unique. There is no sin that's special. There is no sin that's unique. It's always the same stupid thing over and over and over and over again. So what we see in Genesis 3 is the same thing that we see happening today in the attack on women and the attack on men and the attack on children in the West today. It's the exact same thing. And so we know that the way to combat what's happening today is the same way that the fall of man was solved. It's through joining ourselves as a united whole in our respective social orders in what we are meant to be. We join ourselves teleologically to Christ. And it is through joining ourselves to Christ in our respective orders and in our respective hierarchies that we are then joined to the complete destruction of this of the serpent, of this disgusting, perverted nonsense that we see happening today. And on that note, on that happy note, thanks for watching.